Hi guys, it's me. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to a new video. And in today's video, we're going to be doing our November reading wrap up. And November was a really interesting reading month for me. I read a lot of dystopian books as well as a couple of weird girl literature. So we've got a couple of unsettling reads to get into for this month. And as always, I read and DNF'd 6 books, and that was 2 dystopians, 1 romance, 1 literary horror, 1 YA, and 1 nonfiction. But let's just get straight on into the books. The first book that I read this month was Slaughterhouse Five by Vonnegut. This book was actually written in a very abstract way. We kind of follow this irregular time pattern where we don't really know at what point in time we are at in the story. We jump in between moments and memories and ideas of our protagonist. And I found Vonnegut's writing style in this novel to be extremely straightforward, but also quite trusting of the reader. He really just puts forth what he wants to say, and you as a reader are left with the information to come to your own conclusion. Of course, in my mind and in my own analysis, I feel like this book has a very surface level understanding that you can draw from it, or a deeper critique which you can gain from it if you look not even that much beyond the surface of the novel, which I really appreciated. It's written in a way where we can analyze it to gain a deeper understanding of what Vonnegut is trying to put forth. So in this novel, we are following Billy Pilgrim as he is an older man living in America after he has participated in the World War. We essentially are following Billy because he is an older man who is recounting his time in the war and also is suffering from a supposed alien invasion, which he alleges he knew about for many years but just kept to himself, and now he has begun to speak prolifically about this alien species that has decided to invade Earth and who have actually abducted him according to his own tellings. And so in this novel we kind of move back and forth between Billy's time in the war and his time allegedly on with the aliens in their spaceship and being watched by aliens, and also in the current timeline of having to deal with his family's reaction to his coming out with his ideas of alien abduction. We are introduced to Billy as a young man who has the ability to play the organ and is actually sent up to the war as an ill-prepared soldier who was kind of thrust into a position where he was supposed to be assisting a priest, but due to the unfortunate circumstances of war, he was put in a position where he's roaming around with other American soldiers looking to find an American base so they can return safely back home. But as Billy is in this war environment, he's ill prepared and he knows nothing of war and how to protect himself. His character is incredibly weak, and there are many moments where he wants to give up simply, but as he's quite literally in the belly of the beast, he has no choice but to continue. These men get captured by German soldiers and they are taken into intermittent camps, and from that point onwards Billy witnesses the horrific truth of the war and tragedies unfold in front of him. And the main conflict of the novel is the horrible bombing of Dresden, which Billy and some other soldiers survive, and the ultimate destruction and death that he witnessed as a young man, and how this affects him in his later age. And as an older man, Billy seeks to write a book about his time in Dresden for many years, but he never can quite get to the point where he completes the novel. And this novel was really amazing for me to read. I enjoyed so many of its themes. There are a lot of themes that are actually explored in this novel, including post-traumatic stress disorder, the idea of time, how our minds and how we handle stress and trauma, and how we can construct entire worlds out of individual things and believe them entirely. We also explore the brutality of war and how poorly treated the soldiers are. There also is subtle critique on the American spirit and the great American culture and how it is permeated by greed and capitalism. Just a tiny bit of a critique on that. Also a critique on American spirit through manners and working together with other people, and how Americans value competition over everything. The story overall was such a beautiful allegory, and it was such an amazing exploration of trauma. And the aliens that have abducted Billy are called Tremalfadorians, and they have the ability to view an object in its complete temporal stages entirely in one moment. So say when viewing a human, you would see them from a child up until an old man as this sort of conjoined centipede, and they have this kind of holistic, I guess you could say, view of the events that occur in the universe. And they have this universal phrase of "so it goes," where Tremalfadors see time in a different way to humans, and they don't really question the meaning or the reasoning behind certain conflicts or actions. They just kind of know that the future exists and there will be another step, and so it goes. And Vonnegut kind of uses the "so it goes" as a sort of like memorial phrase that he repeats across this novel, and it was just a really lovely touch to this amazing book. When thinking about this book, you could take it quite literally and say that yes, Billy Pilgrim was abducted and this is a sci-fi novel, or you could delve a little bit deeper and say that Billy Pilgrim is suffering from PTSD, so he has created a world in which an author which he read after he came back from the war, and the world that author created has now become true, because a lot of the stories of alien abduction that Billy believes are quite literally copy and paste from a novel that he read. And we kind of are following Billy throughout the book in this very disjointed PTSD way, and I love how this book is written where it feels like we're almost kind of experiencing these episodes with Billy, of like just suddenly jumping from one memory to another memory to another memory. Very disjointed, an amazing portrayal of what the mind of a man suffering from PTSD could look like. There were a few aspects of this book that I found difficult to read, and that was, I just felt like the way that the women were portrayed in this book was slightly sexist. I genuinely feel like the way he portrayed the wife, who he mocked incessantly for being larger framed, the way he portrayed his daughter, who stepped up to take care of him while he was going through his episodes of PTSD, who he portrayed as some sort of tyrannical woman, and also just having another woman in the story and treating her entirely as an object. And I just felt like it just got to a point where the book was just disrespecting women, and I did not like that part of it. I don't know if this is a spoiler, but like in the novel there's literally a very crude drawing of a woman's body included, and I just found that to be extremely unnecessary. I didn't think that it was at all necessary to have such a crude drawing, but I'll show you the drawing. So I don't know if that's gonna get spoiled or so I just felt like he disrespected women a lot in this book, and that aspect of it took it from a 5-star for me down to a 4-star read. But I still would recommend this book, honestly. I feel like it's so short, but it genuinely was extremely eye-opening, and it was such an amazing reading experience, and I just enjoyed almost all of this book, so I would 100% recommend. The next book that I read in November was Love and Other Words by Christina Lauren, and this was the book club pick of November. In this novel, we are following Macy, and she is a pediatric surgeon or doctor who is in America, and she has moved on from her first love and is now staying in California with her current fiance and his daughter. And the man that she has moved on from is Elliot, and he is a bookseller, I believe. Supposedly they had a huge falling out many years ago, and someone holds blame, or they both hold blame, but they are both not really 100% happy with how things have gone, and Elliot particularly wants Macy back. So starting with the things that I liked, I think there were definitely a couple of swoon-worthy moments in this book. Just a couple of moments that were heartwarming and a little bit cute. I mean, overall, thinking about how it was written, I think it was okay, but there were moments where I felt like I was kicking my feet, and I felt like I loved the lines, and I felt like they were not necessarily deep, but they were cute, and also it was just like incredibly quick and easy to read, so that was enjoyable to some extent. And there are a few reasons why I'm usually reluctant to read romance books, and that's because they can be extremely cliched, and this book had that. I am not a big fan of books that are written as if it was a movie script. I'm just like, if you're trying to do a screenplay, do a screenplay. If you're trying to do a book, do a book. So this book did have that kind of slightly screenplay-y way of being written, which is not my favorite personally. And it had like a lot of convenient moments, like things conveniently happened in order to push the characters forward in their romantic endeavors and to get essentially the outcome that the authors wanted. Another thing was that I didn't necessarily like the characters. I didn't really connect to them. I didn't fully understand them, but especially Elliot, I just felt like he was very pushy, and I don't know, I understand the idea of like having someone to push you past your boundaries and to maybe be there to catch you, but I felt like he was just lacking in so much empathy, and he was also just incredibly selfish, especially when dealing with other women. I just didn't like how Elliot was written. And Macy, I also didn't really like her. I didn't like how she handled the ending of her engagement. It just felt, like I said, convenient. The engagement was simply there to exist as a loose obstacle to their romance. But with all of that being said, I definitely found the book enjoyable on a whole. I just think the reading experience was just so easy, as well as like just a couple of cute moments here and there. I just opened the book just now, and there's this line. I'm gonna read it to you. It's, "Sometimes it feels like I think about you every minute," he whispered. And it's really simple, but it's like, if you're if you've liked someone, it just kind of is relatable. So like, I think because I'm human and I have felt feelings for people before, I liked it. It was cute. Again, there were parts that did feel incredibly cliche, incredibly convenient, a couple of plot holes which just genuinely did not make any sense, and also, again, they felt juvenile. We are following them through their high school years while they meet, and it does feel kind of juvenile at points, to be honest. Even as they're older, it feels a bit juvenile. And there was also another instance in this book where they were dealing with a sexual assault incident, and I felt like that wasn't handled in the best way. It just was very vague and ambiguous, and I feel like it should have been handled in a more clear way, because it's just very muddy and very, very vague as to the circumstances and how things are resolved. So I just felt like that was just another thing that took down points for this book. But if you're looking for a light and easy palate cleansing book, then I guess I could recommend this one. The next book that I read in November was Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Basterica, and this was probably my favorite book that I had read all of November. And if you have seen my Thought Daughter Diaries, the first episode, I actually started reading this book in that video, and I also showed a bit of the process of me annotating this book, and I just have to say that I completely loved this book. It was extremely well known and well recommended, and It honestly met all of my expectations. It exceeded my expectations in a lot of ways as well. This book has a lot of different genres that it can fall into, including dystopian, feminist, horror, body horror. It just covers a wide range of topics. It is incredibly short and sweet. It is around the 200-page mark, and honestly, I feel like I could read a lot more of this world and of this story. There's just a couple perspectives that we could hear from. If she wanted to expand on it, she definitely could. But even though I feel like it could be expanded on, I don't feel like it was left in an odd place. I feel like everything ended where it needed to, and ending it at the place that she did kind of was its own statement in a lot of ways. I am obsessed with the many meanings that we can derive from this book. A critique on capitalism, a critique on patriarchy, a critique on so many things that are just inherently feminist and pro-people, very pro-human, which is quite funny. A book about eating humans is pro-human. This book was eye-opening and alarming. Do I think that we would turn into a society where humans eat other humans? No, but I mean, even given the pandemic, we have seen that we can get to a point of man-made hysteria or man-made diseases contaminating animals. I mean, even within the book, the idea of the contamination of the animals is not 100% believed and not 100% concrete. It might as well have been a tool for control used by the governments in order to control the people and to control population and to further stratify society into the haves and the have-nots. This book was amazing. I wanted to read this because of the hype, and the hype was 100% valid in the case of this book, which isn't always the case. And I just completely loved our narrator. And if you don't know anything about this book, it actually follows a world in which a natural catastrophe has led to animals being contaminated, and this contamination can spread to humans that eat these animals. Therefore, all animals, including pets, have been mass burnt, and humans now gain their sources of protein from essentially other humans that are bred. And we don't really see the world through the eyes of these heads. That's what they're called, humans that are bred. But essentially we can imagine the fact that they are humans, and even though they do not get taught language, they still can communicate in their own rudimentary forms, and they still hold human emotion. And it is very painful that and it's actually just such a statement that the heads are essentially such a huge point in the book, but we get so little of their inner world and their own interactions with the system that they are living in. And I think that was such an interesting point of the novel. We do follow our main protagonist, Marcos, as he is grappling with the idea of his unhappiness in this world, and we kind of, I don't want to say root for him, but we are a little bit disillusioned by his motivations. And in the end, I think Marcos stands as a testament to the enduring nature of the system and the enduring greed that allows for the permeation of injustices within our society. This is not a very happy book. It is in some ways quite grotesque. I know a lot of people said that they couldn't read it and it made them sick to their stomachs. I didn't feel quite scared as that. I just felt more of an unsettling feeling while I was reading this. And there were some scenes where we're given a tour of the processing factory where these humans are processed for their meat, and we get quite in depth in that process. And like I said, it didn't make me sick to my stomach, but it was just incredibly interesting, all of the tiny nuances and all of the things that Augustina put into this book. Every single piece of information has its place and nothing is added as filler. It's an incredibly well thought out book, and I feel like it's so poignant and it leaves a lot of room for discussion and critique. Once again, 5 stars, an amazing book, and one that I would recommend to people who are interested in dystopian and feminist writing. The next book that I read in November was Monstrilio by Gerado, Sámano, Córdova. I don't know if I said that right, but hopefully I did. And this is another literary horror book. And the synopsis of this book is essentially that we are following a family comprised of Joseph and Margot, and they're the two parents of Santiago. And Santiago is a little boy who is born with only one lung, and from a very young age he has been dealing with a lot of health complications around this, and it was always expected that Santiago would not make it very long in life, and he lives up until the age of 11 years old. And once he passes away, his mother Margot decides to cut off a piece of his lung in order to have a piece of him with her as she begins to mourn and grieve her son. Due to local myth, Margot decides to feed the piece of lung that she has extracted. She has a family friend who actually did something of a similar vein, feeding a piece of a human heart, I believe, in order to create a spouse for herself, but things didn't end well in that story, allegedly. So Margot does this thing and she feeds the piece of the lung, and it slowly grows into becoming a furry round blob with black eyes and a arm tail with a claw which it uses to hang itself up from places and to jump from place to place. And this monstrous creature slowly grows into Santiago. He looks like Santiago, but as we know, he is made up of more monstrous things, and he isn't Santiago, but he has access to Santiago's memories, and the way that he interacts with those is kind of as an outsider in communication with his memories, understanding that they are not his and not connecting with them. I was very excited to pick up this book. A lot of people have spoken about this, a lot of people have raved about this, and it is honestly incredibly popular, and I was expecting to be properly scared because a lot of people say that this is a horror book, but honestly I felt like more emotions such as sadness and happiness and tenderness throughout this book rather than fear. In that sense, it turned out a little bit different from what I was expecting. One thing that I really found interesting about this book is that it is incredibly character driven in terms of us getting to know intimately the characters that we interact with while still having a very engaging plot. So it's such a great mixture of characters and their emotions, but also a plot that drives the story forward, which is something that you don't get to see all the time. And in this novel we follow the perspective of 4 characters. Firstly, Margot, the mother, then Lina, Margot's friend, Joseph, the father, and Monstrilio, the son. Out of these 4 narrators, I felt like Margot's narration was the most interesting for me. I just loved how raw and emotional her voice was, and she was incredibly selfish, and she's the type of character who needs to get what she wants, but I just loved her narration style. I loved how honest she was. I loved how her words cut deep. And I think each character has their own voice. Like Lina is a bit more, I don't want to say desperate, but she definitely kind of retreats a lot into herself. And she holds back a lot of her experiences in order to exist within society. And Joseph is his voice was very much in denial. Like he was constantly trying to convince himself of a truth that wasn't there. And M's voice was incredibly self-conscious, and very repressive. It was very, very interesting how those emotional contexts came out separately from each character's perspective. And I did give this book 4 stars. I just felt like it was just one tiny step away from being 5 stars, and I think that was the emotional connection. I just didn't really get to a point where I felt so emotionally connected to the book that I had to give it a 5 stars. I do very much like the book. I love the themes. I love the full circleness of it. It's such an amazing and interesting book, but for me, it just was missing that gut punch. In some moments, I almost feel like if the book was written entirely in Marcos's perspective, it would have been a 5-star for me, but that would have been a completely different novel. And throughout all of our characters and their narrations, there was a common theme of the horror of grief and how grief affected each and every character in a different way, and how they mourned their grief and the things that they did in order to distract themselves from their grief and to rationalize and to try to contort themselves in the many ways that we engage with our emotions in horrible ways, in scary ways, in ways that have outcomes that leave us sort of like bearing the bones of many crimes instead of just sitting quietly with the many thoughts and feelings that we have. This book is a literary horror novel, but like I said earlier, it isn't very scary. I feel like a lot of the emotional themes that I felt the most were more so repression, especially towards the end. There was a lot of conversation about expectations and repressing your true identity in order to fulfill others' expectations, and I really found that those themes were incredibly beautiful to read about. And in this book we have a lot of different queer relationships, and as a lot of people have said, it's treated in a way that is very normal. No one really ever questions the orientation of our characters, and it's quite nice. And there's actually even some moments of insinuation towards the elderly characters being in sort of maybe not physically romantic relationships, but definitely emotionally romantically queer relationships, which is super interesting. And if anything, I think a lot of people are like, oh well, because it is so queer and normative, it doesn't feel realistic. But I feel like in some small way there was this theme of like repressing your true identity and being afraid of judgment, and I'm not saying that should be projected onto the relationships part, but I felt like it was sort of like, it felt almost comparable to people that are dealing with people not accepting them for their sexual orientation. So I found that theme of repressing yourself and finally getting to a point of acceptance really paralleled well with the acceptance of the queer relationships. I'm not sure if they were at all connected, but I thought that was interesting, because that is the world that we live in, where unfortunately a lot of queer people have to repress themselves, and they have to take that journey in order to get to a point of acceptance within their families and within themselves, etc. I thought that the ending of this book was amazing. I thought that the things that happened really just, everything made sense. This was an amazingly well thought out book, and the ending paralleling with the beginning was just such an amazing touch, and the claw and the metaphor that it has, that also was an amazing touch. And I really loved the idea of Monstrilio's hunger. I loved that it expresses itself as a hunger, his monstrosity. Just so many amazing and interesting points in this novel, which just make me very happy. This book towards the end felt very heartwarming, also very sad. It was not that scary, but it's something that touched me, and I think it's a beautiful story on family and love and acceptance and on grief, and it's such a great book, and I enjoyed reading this book. The next book that I read in November was La Casa en Mango Street, which is The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisernos. This book is actually written in Spanish, and it's the first book that I've ever read in Spanish. It's a YA novel, so it's written in quite simple Spanish, but because I've never really read in Spanish before, I have a bunch of annotations and a whole bunch of notes. So this book was incredibly challenging to read. It took me a very long time to read. Once again, I think I underestimated how hard it was going to be to read a book in another language, but it was quite difficult. I'm very happy that I did this. I really want to challenge myself to do hard things in life. But yeah, this was definitely an accomplishment, an achievement for me. And I thoroughly enjoyed the book outside of being very confused a lot of the time with the language and the grammar. I did enjoy the stories that we were told. This book essentially follows Esperanza, and she is a young girl growing up in Chicago. And I actually read the introduction of this book where Esperanza actually worked teaching children, disadvantaged children. And she gained a lot of the inspiration for these stories from her own experience, but also from the children that she taught. So this novel is kind of presented as if a lot of what happens is mostly to Esperanza, but the inspiration kind of comes from a lot of different children and a lot of different people. But we basically follow Esperanza as she is living in Mango Street in Chicago, which is kind of like a more disenfranchised part of Chicago, and we watch as she grows up and goes from being a young girl, and we witness the different lessons that she learns growing up on Mango Street. So it's a bit hard to give a description of the book because it is just these little vignettes of, say, 1 or 2 page long stories that kind of follow a singular moment within her life. And we cover topics such as the neighbors not speaking English and growing up and becoming a woman, wearing heels, the struggle with money, with poverty, the struggle with the police, the struggle with learning with men, with boys, the struggle with family members. And honestly, I genuinely enjoyed this book. And I more so enjoyed the fact that I was able to challenge myself to do something difficult. And it's something that I definitely want to do more in the future. So I gave this 4 stars because it was such an achievement for me. And one thing I did really like about this book is there's kind of this overarching theme of like female independence, which I found to be extremely exciting and empowering. There's a lot of stories about how women are locked up in houses because their husbands believe that that is where they belong and they do not need to be anywhere else. And we kind of end the book on this note of like, I want to have my own home, and my home will be a place of love and light and peace and happiness and good things, and not really controlled by men or a man or by marriage. And I think that there's a lot of interesting commentary on the role of a woman in society in this novel, which I did not expect. It is under 200 pages, so I guess you could say it's the perfect length. But because, once again, I'm not very good at Spanish, it took me so long to read. But I'm super proud of myself, and I would recommend this book to anyone, really. The next book that I read / DNF'd was Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates. And I picked up this book because I wanted to become more educated on feminist issues. But unfortunately, I decided to DNF the book at 36%. And this book is a non-fiction book that follows the different groups of men that hate women. This book follows groups such as incels, pickup artists, MGTOWs, MRAs. It provides a deep dive into each one of these groups and the nuances that exist between them. I personally found the book to be incredibly repetitive because each and every chapter sort of delved into a different subsect of these women-hating groups, and among these groups there's a lot of overlap. So it just began to feel like in every single chapter we were introducing the same facts over and over again, and I felt like the structures of the chapter were quite similar but just stuffed with different information, and that just made it very difficult to read. I felt like the information was presented in a very unorganized way. It was extremely hard to read, and it just felt like a lot of word dumping onto the page. It just did not feel structured at all in terms of how the information was presented. I felt like the book was very dense and it made the reading experience horrible. Like, there was just so many words on the page and it just felt like a lot of it did not have to be there. It felt very bloated in the story, and there were things that were being communicated, but it just was so repetitive and so bloated. Just got to the point where I could not continue reading this book. The chapters were very predictable, and instead of speaking on the sections that overlap, once we went over things over and over again, and it just felt it was not fun to read. And even when I'm reading something that is educational and non-fiction, I still would like for it to be written in a thoughtful manner. Over time, I began to lose interest in the book and I just could not bring myself to pick it up, unfortunately. I don't know if I would recommend this book because I just could not jive with the writing, but I've seen so many reviews online of people loving it. So if you are someone who's interested in this information, and also like some of the information I was already quite familiar with, like I already knew about incels and I knew about MGTOW, I knew about pickup artists to some extent, but I did learn certain things. Honestly, I agreed with a lot of her points. I didn't DNF it because I was angry at the book at all. It was just very difficult to read. And I did learn some new jargon and facts and statistics which were interesting to read about, but I could not finish this book, and that is a big shame. So that is it. Those are the 6 books that I read and DNF'd in November. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it was entertaining, and I hope you got some book inspo for your next reads. Please leave a like and a comment down below of what your favorite read was in November, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.